right, it is 7 p.m., so I'm going to get us going. So my name is Gianna. I'm the head of reference here at the Chelmsford Public Library. Thank you all so much for being here for our History of Activism through Cookbooks. So food has often been a way for activist communities to fundraise, connect, and spread the word about their cause. We'll look at the origins of the link between food and activism with the abolitionist food writers of the Civil War. We'll unpack the suffrage cookbooks from the turn of the 20th century and the earliest LGBTQ cooking pamphlets. Finally, we'll analyze the People's Cookbook of Philadelphia, a community of organizers depicted through recipes. Lastly, we'll talk about how food is still used to connect and advocate for causes to this day. And to introduce our presenter tonight, we have Sarah Lohman. She is a culinary historian and the author of the best-selling book, 8 Flavors, The Untold Story of American Cuisine, and more recently, Endangered Eating, Exploring America's Vanishing Cuisine, released in 2023. She focuses on the history of food as a way to access the stories of diverse Americans. Her work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and NPR. She has presented across the country from the Smithsonian Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., to the Culinary Historians of Southern California. So without further ado, let me pass it over to Sarah Lohman.
Hi, everyone. Yes, the audio was low, but I think that mine is coming in at a normal level. So I'm going to talk quietly for just a moment to give you a chance to adjust your volume. I hope I'm not bursting anybody's eardrums now. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be back. It's been ages since I've been here. My hair is purple. Thank you for sticking with us on this program. We've had to reschedule a couple times because of wide variance of reasons. And I'm so happy to be here now. We have a lot of ground we can cover, so I am going to get right into it here. If you do have questions, we welcome those in the chat. We are a little bit of a larger group today, so if you've done a talk with me before, you know that sometimes I like to answer as I'm going and making it more of a conversation. But today, I'm going to save the Q&A for the end. Now, what that means, though, is if you think, because we're going to be traveling through time here. So if you think of a question as we're going, please feel free to put it in the chat right away. Within the last 15 or 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes of the program, we are going to go through those questions and answer them and any other questions you might have. That's the plan. So as was said, I'm Sarah Lohman. I'm a food historian. Today, we're going to look at a history of activism through cookbooks. If you're on Facebook or Instagram, my handle is at 4 pounds flour, or you can look me up by my name and you'll find me on there. Okay, so let's get to it. So we need to explore the origins a little bit of how activism was expressed through cookbooks. And prior to the 19th century, really the only sort of food related activism things were people who were striking that were in a certain guild or a broadside that sort of referenced something going on in a certain food related industry. I don't see a food person or a cookbook related to activism until the 1830s and 40s. So Lydia Maria Child was a major, I was going to say influencer, and you know what? I'm going to go for it. She was a major influencer of the first half of the 19th century. She was sort of an expert on home advice. Sort of interesting. She was not married. She did not have kids herself. I believe she was actually a widower and turned to writing to be able to support herself. But she would put together these incredible books like The American Frugal Housewife by talking to wives and mothers and collecting their assembled knowledge. So she was a really well-known person, especially by the 1830s when her first sort of, it's recipes, but it's also medicine. It's also tips. There's a section on how to raise your daughters. It's a lot of things like that. But in 1836, so about 4 years after her very famous home advice and cookbook came out, she released a book called An Appeal in the Favor of That Class called of Americans Called Africans by Mrs. Child. She also wrote, it says the mother's own book, the girl's own book, the frugal housewife. These are all like, girl's own book was like activity books. Mother's book was advice. Very prolific writer, but also an ardent abolitionist. She was extremely educated. She was extremely liberal. She believed in the total abolition of slavery, an immediate abolition of slavery without any remittances is not quite the word I want, basically without any money paid to those enslavers, which was quite a radical stance at the time. Most people believed in gradual abolition, which is what New York state did in the first half of the 19th century, is gradual abolition. And some people believed that there should be a reimbursement to the enslavers after the release of their enslaved. And she said, none of that. People should be free. And in her book, she included illustrations like the ones you can see on the right of the different types of shackles used on the enslaved, of the living conditions on board ships when they were trafficked from Africa. This book didn't pull any punches. Now, it is not a cookbook, but I did want to include it as sort of a pre-activist cookbook because she was such an activist herself and, sort of gained her fame through her cookbooks. She also helped to publish and sort of introduced and co-supported a narrative of a woman who was enslaved. I cannot remember her name right now, excuse me, but it was often published with the narrative of 12 Years a Slave too. So a major influence in this time period and actually put her career at great risk because of her outspoken anti-slavery attitude. Her Boston publisher actually dropped her and her books went out of print for quite a while. But she's remembered for her legacy as an influence on the social sphere, but also being an extremely outspoken humanitarian too. And sort of along that line, I think a couple, let's say like pre-activist cookbooks of note include the House Servants Directory, which was published in 1827. This book was written by Robert Roberts. Robert Roberts was the head of a household, meaning he was essentially like the valet, the head butler of a household in Massachusetts. He was the head of staff for a Massachusetts senator at that time, and he was also Black. So this is the first book that has been written by and credited to a Black man named Robert Roberts. And sort of like the male professional flip side of the books that Lydia Mariah Child was writing, you can see that this book does include recipes. And there are recipes for food, there are recipes for medicine. But on this page here, there are recipes or instructions, I guess you could call them, to correct a bad taste or sourness of wine, to preserve good wine to the last, to recover a person from intoxication. And then on the other page, you just see a recipe for something like lemonade. There's also like how to black boots, how to shine silver. And also it's really an instruction, as you can see from this front cover that lists everything that's inside, of also how to run a household, how to lay out tables, the art of waiting, meaning how to wait on a table and serve food. So it is a cookbook with recipes. It is also a look into the life of um it is also a look into the life of someone who was a free Black man running a household in the 1820s and what that culture was like as well. So sometimes activism, we're going to talk more specifically about different categories of activism, but sometimes activism is just as simple as saying, I'm here, my life is normal, my life is equal. So I also sort of identify these early books by Black Americans within this category of activism. This is the first cookbook written by a Black woman. It was published in 1866, actually really self-published. The author, Mrs. Melinda Russell, an experienced cook, she paid to have this book published. She had moved after the Civil War to Paw Paw, Michigan, and decided she really didn't like it and she wanted to go home to Tennessee. So she wrote this book and published it as a fundraiser to send her home. We don't know if this worked out. As far as we can tell, she was a single mother. She had a child. And we have no idea the sort of before and after, other than this one look into her life. It focuses a lot on baking. You can see that there's a whole page here for plain pound cake, cork cake, which doesn't involve cork. I can't imagine why it's called cork cake. Sponge cake, Dover cake, Washington cake, maybe it's from County Cork, red dough cake, braided bread cake. You tend to see a lot more baking recipes in cookbooks of this time because baking is a little bit more precise, takes a little bit more explaining. Although, of course, I'm sure if any of you can look at one of these recipes, you'll see that you wouldn't maybe not describe these recipes as precise. For example, that cork cake is 3 cups sugar, 1 cup butter, 1 cup sour cream, 5 cups flour, 5 eggs, 1 teaspoon soda, 1 teaspoon cream tartar, flavor with lemon. And those are all the instructions. Not uncommon for this era. This is what most historical cookbooks look like in the 19th century. Now, the thing that is really cool about Melinda Russell's cookbook, here are a few wine recipes as well, is that she gives an introduction where she tells her own story and why she's writing this cookbook, but she also credits the people who have been influences on her. She credits the Virginia Housewife, which is a cookbook published in 1824, a really important regional Southern cookbook, as one of her sources as how she learned how to cook. She also credits the elder Black woman that she taught under when she was enslaved in, the elder Black woman that she cooked under and who taught her when she was enslaved in Tennessee. I don't remember the name off the top of her head, excuse me, but what is remarkable about that is that those sort of resources, and especially those legacies of Black women, are usually lost to history or actively erased from the past. So to have this material that tells a Black woman's story and talks about her influences and talks about other Black women is quite remarkable. So, to get into more in line with what we might think of as a official cookbook that is an activism cookbook, meaning that perhaps it is pushing a agenda, perhaps it's trying to raise money. We don't really see that happening until after the Civil War. So during the Civil War era, there were these exhibitions in the North called sanitary fairs. And they had such a peculiar name because it was realized that the Union was losing more soldiers to disease because of unsanitary camp conditions than they were in battle or of injuries sustained in battle. So these sanitary fairs would raise money to be able to, dig appropriate toilets, to dig a stopgap sewer system, to really provide a cleaner camp environment for the soldiers so they didn't die of disease. Um, Oftentimes there were like bake sales and craft sales, and the money would go to support the troops. Sometimes there were more extravagant ones, like the sanitary fair in Brooklyn took up multiple rooms in an enormous building. And one of the rooms was styled as a historical restaurant. And the people there were dressed like men and women from the Revolutionary War era, so about 80 years before. And there was a big open hearth that they were cooking on, like a big open fire instead of a stove. I'm obsessed with moments when like people in the past are like dressed up as people in the past. Because I think here in the present, we all always think of things being like very flat and very close together. Whereas they were doing this like super nostalgic, like eat like your grandparents. These are times, simpler times gone by that we've lost in the hustle and bustle of the 1860s. Super fascinating. Now, I have read several places that as a result of these charitable fundraising events, which were a pretty new idea, that also as a part of this, women started publishing recipe books that they would sell. Now, that being said, I have not seen a physical example of one of these sanitary fair cookbooks or recipe books anywhere. And I've not seen any period references to it. I've only seen contemporary secondary sources saying they exist. So, as a historian, it makes me suspicious. I think that it's a good logical leap with the movement of the time, but until I see evidence from the time period, I'm not buying it. But in general, it's right after this era in the 1870s that we begin to see cookbooks published by things like churches in particular, but then also by like Rotary clubs and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America. So these sort of community cookbooks that are also fundraisers. We're not going to get into those too deeply today. Those are one type of activism. Even more importantly, they're often a really fascinating and valuable look into a local community and what this community was actually preparing in their kitchens. They're incredibly valuable to food historians and people studying regional cuisine. That being said, they're not purely activism, they're fundraiser cookbooks, and sometimes they're connected and sometimes they're not. So I want to acknowledge them and then leave them. So, one of the larger sort of activism movements in the 19th century is actually the vegetarianism movement, if you can believe it. So, I think that these books, even though they sort of predate that 1860s, this is when we're starting to think of activism moment, um, they are advocating for eating a certain way based on moral and political grounds. So, in my mind, that seems very activism heavy. The earliest example, or one of the earliest examples, but perhaps the most influential, is Graham on bread. Reverend Sylvester Graham was a preacher. He wrote a treatise on bread and bread making. It is about bread and it isn't. It's about the morality of bread, the holiness of bread, bread as the center of a happy, healthy home, a mother making bread out of whole grains, which wasn't popular at that time, which is better for your health, your vitality. Not only was Graham really focused on bread and its essence at the core of the family, which is interesting because Graham himself was an orphan. And it seemed that in his writing, he really upheld this ideal of the domestic sphere and mother cooking and the kids around the table that perhaps didn't exist for him, but perhaps doesn't exist for anybody, to be honest. But Graham was also a vegetarian. So, in addition to advocating for whole grain bread, he also said that people should not eat meat. Meat makes people violent. He also didn't believe in spices or spicing, which he believed also made people lustful, as did caffeine and alcohol. So, water was really the only acceptable drink under the Grahamite diet. Now, his name probably sounds familiar because he did invent a particular type of whole grain flour that is still sold today and is used to make a particular type of cracker, the graham cracker. Now, Graham, though, would be pretty horrified by the whole wheat crackers that bear his name today, because he also, of course, didn't believe in sugar, as that would also make you too agitated and violent. Also, though, many abolitionists did not consume white sugar at this time because it was slave produced. So it, in a way, isn't surprising that not eating sugar was a part of his like moral belief system. Now, he was very famous. He toured, he lectured, and he was highly influential because he also founded Oberlin College in Ohio. Oberlin obviously still exists today, is a very respected college. Students there in the 19th century were required to uphold this vegetarian diet, but many people did because it was one of the first universities in the country to admit women. It also admitted indigenous people as well, and it had the first Black female graduate in the country. So maybe the Graham diet wasn't all bad. The earliest example, though, came out 2 years earlier, Nature's Own Book. This is a New York edition of a British cookbook. And this is the very first vegetarian cookbook ever published. All the recipes are vegetarian in it, and it really shocked me to know the vegetarianism went back this far. We also have a mainstream vegetarianism coming in at the turn of the 20th century with John Harvey Kellogg, another name that should sound so familiar. It's remarkable how these very, like, in the time, they kind of had these really wild ideas that were very far outside of the mainstream. I mean, in John Harvey Kellogg's time at the turn of the 20th century, it was not uncommon to have like multiple meats for your breakfast. And now we have a bowl of cereal, and all of that influence is all Kellogg. Now, Lena Francis Cooper ran his kitchen, the director of the Battle Creek Sanitarium School of Home Economics, head dietitian of the Battle Creek Sanitarium. The Battle Creek Sanitarium was a health spa in Battle Creek, Michigan, where the rich and the famous would go to have various medical ailments treated. Some of them were very treatable by this diet. It was very high in fiber, and constipation was a huge problem at the end of the 19th century when you're having like a 3 or 4 meat breakfast. He also, though, did some things that probably hurt the patients. Like he was big into radiation therapy. It's very different than chemo. He was just exposing people to radiation, and some people died, unsurprisingly. But the cookbook is not only fascinating, but I've made many of these recipes. They're delicious, including produce, which you can see the recipe for on the top of the right-hand page. It includes cabbage, diced carrots, celery, parsley, turnips, salt. Oh, he adds produce into his produce. Basically, it was a peanut loaf made with like peanut butter, unsweetened peanut butter, and seitan, which is wheat gluten, and some spices. And you could like, you could fry it up like a steak. Basically, Kellogg is not only the person who invented breakfast cereal, but he also invented meat analogs, which is the sort of industry term for anything like a Morningstar chicken nugget today or a Beyond Burger. Proteus and Nuttolene were the early 20th century versions of that. I made some Proteus. Again, really not that bad. Really not that bad. Here's some of his other recipes. This one wasn't spectacular, but there's a lot of cream, like a lot of heavy cream in a lot of the dishes, which really, really helped the flavor of them. Interestingly, the first raw food cookbook comes out in 1904, advocating for people to not cook their food. It bears some similarities to the modern raw food movement in that Mr. and Mrs. Eugene Christian believed that by heating food, you break down a lot of its nutrients, and so you should leave everything raw. It's different from the modern movement in that modern raw food is, as far as I know, always vegan, whereas this book includes raw seafood and raw beef, like tartar. There's also raw eggs and raw milk involved in this as well. And they basically said that this diet cured them of many ailments, which in my mind makes this very similar to many eating trends today, which promise to do this or that or the other in 30 or 60 days. But the most fascinating thing, because all of these books, they are activism books also because they always have like this manifesto at the beginning of them where they tell you why you should eat this way and why it's important. And one of their big ideas, which I found fascinating, is women's liberation. They said if women aren't in the kitchen cooking 3 meals a day, if they're simply cutting up some beautiful fresh fruits, they have more time to pursue other things in their life, which is the same sort of argument and one of the big reasons that women embraced convenience food and processed food in the 20th century, because some of them needed more time to do things like work outside of the home, and some of them wanted more time to do things like have leisure, spend it with their children, or read. And as someone who has periodically recreated historical diets, I will tell you that basically, as soon as I finished one meal, I was back in the kitchen starting to cook the next one. But not when I did this meal. And it really was just like 2 oranges and a beautiful salad and these weird little rolls that you cook at a weird temperature. I didn't drink raw milk, by the way. I do not endorse raw milk. Some banana chips, some walnuts, some cheese, like simple, but girl dinner. It's absolutely girl dinner of 1904 or 1914, whenever this came out. I didn't mind it. And, if we can get a little personal, my bowel movements were very regular. And then there was also a vegan movement starting in 1910. This book, No Animal Food, is a vegan cookbook. There is only vegetables and grains here. Their big manifesto argument is that at this time, America is dealing with an epidemic of food adulteration. And they've only just passed laws to begin to control what can be added to food, quality control in processing plants, truth in advertising. That just happened in 1906. So No Animal Food sort of argues, a lot of this food we know from the media is poison, especially milk. There was a huge issue with adulteration of milk and milk poisonings. So their argument is, why are you eating it at all? Eat nice, safe things like fresh fruits and vegetables and grains. Also, I have to admit, there are some sort of homemade meat analogs in there. This one was made with breadcrumbs and pine nuts and served over squash. It was delicious. A beautiful salad. There's a lot of stereotypes that people in the 19th and early 20th century just ate a lot of heavy foods. It's more like we just didn't necessarily write those recipes down, but this was a lovely salad that was like, do you have berries? Do you have fresh herbs? What's in your garden? It felt very modern. And then actually one of my favorite things I ate was bachelor's dinner. It was root vegetables cooked with soy sauce and unsweetened peanut butter. So it had this flavor almost like a Thai peanut sauce. And then you had it with the meat analog of your choice. This is some little, chicken fillet I picked up at the grocery store. Some 19th century meat analogs are still available. Kellogg was a Seventh-day Adventist. And so there's There's a Seventh-day Adventist company that still makes a lot of his products. You can find them online if you're ever really curious. I have had them. It's mostly just like different variations of seitan, essentially. I don't think it even delves into soy. But this was delicious. I actually made it after I did this week of eating this raw food diet. Okay, let's touch on a little bit of like maybe misguided activism too at the turn of the 20th century. Some of you might know this book. I have a copy that belonged to my grandmother from the 1930s. This is an earlier edition from 1901. The Way to a Man's Heart, the Settlement Cookbook. This was a cookbook put together by a woman working in a settlement house in Milwaukee. Settlement houses were social work institutions that were established privately. They weren't government institutions at the turn of the 20th century when we were seeing a massive wave of immigration. From about 1880 to 1920, that is our peak immigration. Millions of people were coming in per year. Specifically, this book was designed for new Jewish immigrants to teach them to be more American. We see this pattern sort of across the country, that there is this older wave of German Jewish and now Jewish Americans who were a little concerned by the newcomers and how Jewish they were. And they were Yiddish speaking and they wouldn't cut their hair and they wanted to keep kosher. And so, one way to assimilate new immigrants is through food. So, this book was designed to like teach them to be less weird, or so this older generation of German American Jewish immigrants felt. And it's super fascinating because actually, my grandmother was not Jewish, she was Catholic. This book ended up being so popular because it was this compendium of Midwestern cooking. And she made this coconut cake every single Easter, as my mom remembers. And those are my grandmother's notes in there. She likes orange zest, or liked orange zest as opposed to lemon zest. That's what her note says. I also made a wonderful recipe for challah, which is the traditional braided enriched bread that is eaten on Friday nights at Shabbat. There are Passover recipes in here, kosher for Passover recipes, but then there's also recipes for like lobster, which is not kosher at all. If you're keeping kosher, if you're Jewish, you're not supposed to be eating lobster, but it was really, really popular in America. So it's walks this really interesting line of, okay, it's Passover. This is an important holiday that revolves around food. So here are these food traditions, or Shabbat. But then it's also like, well, but Americans eat oysters and lobsters. So if you could just like also get on board with that, that'd be great. Fascinating book. We see other social work cookbooks and food information books coming out at this time on a pretty wide spectrum of being helpful and hurtful to new immigrants. This one is by Bertha Wood, dietitian, food clinic, Boston dispensary. She was working in she was a social worker in Boston working in settlement houses. And you can see that her chapters are divided up by different immigrant groups: Mexicans, Portuguese, Italians, Hungarians, Poles, and other Slavic people, the Near East, Jews. And sometimes she's more forgiving of people's quizzes of different cuisines than others. She says something very insightful in the Italian chapter, in that she says that the Italians are eating much more meat now that they're in America. Basically, they're making more money and meat is cheaper here than they were back in Italy. And that is having pretty severe health effects on Italian immigrants. She was absolutely right. Actually, one of the major concerns to this day is that when it comes to diet, immigrants assimilate too quickly to an American diet, which is not very good. That means that more meat and more fast food is being introduced in their diets, and sugar, which are all unhealthy compared to diets that people had back home. But there's also a little bit of xenophobia in there, because basically she's saying, and this is an attitude of the time, that Italians who stayed in Italy are the good Italians, but the ones who came here are poor and ignorant and don't know how to eat. And you can also pick it up in their writing too. So this is from the end. She'll have recipes for typical dishes from each culture, because she does have this idea of like, if you can kind of talk to them in their food language, then we can improve the health of these recipes. But she said, as the Americans come north or intermarry, it would be better for the children and adults to learn to eat the simpler foods of the American people, boiled or baked with less spice and fat. Any nurse or dietitian can persuade them to use cereals or baked or boiled fish and meats and vegetables if they gradually reduce the amount of tomato or pepper for flavor until it becomes a bland dish, easier to digest and not harmful to the kidneys. So we see a little bit of reference actually to Graham and his sort of not based in fact nutritional info that bland is better. But also at this time, home economics had been created, domestic science had been created. We had discovered things like calories and nutrients and vitamins. And because we suddenly had some of this scientific knowledge about food, the thought was that since like spices don't have calories or vitamins in them, they were not important and shouldn't be included in food. So that's why American food gets real rough right around the turn of the 20th century, because women like Bertha Wood are like white sauce on everything, boil it, boil it, boil it, no tomato or pepper, bland dishes only. Pretty upsetting. Hot milk soup. Oh, look, she put some allspice into it. Another one is New Homes for Old from 1921. This one was really targeted at Italian families by a woman named Sophonisba Breckenridge, which is really quite a marvelous name. This is one of the dishes from it. So again, it's this idea of learn how to cook like the Italians so you can kind of work with them. Food was delicious, was very accurate to Italian diets at the time. It is a little bit of know your enemy, but Breckenridge was a little bit of a warmer writer when it came to talking about new immigrant communities. But this was part of a larger series of books put up by the Carnegie Foundation that was all about American assimilation. Basically, like, let's just whitewash people and turn them into the blandest version of a boiled meat dish that they can. So, another big activism movement at this time is, of course, suffrage, the women's right to vote. Between 1880 and 1919, there were more than a dozen suffrage cookbooks, probably countless pamphlets that were also published. This might seem counterintuitive to us today because as women are fighting for the right to vote, you think, well, they must be fighting for independence and new roles in the world. The real belief was in order to get suffrage, you also had to convince the men of this world that women weren't going to revolt, which was a genuine fear that men had, that they were going to have to wear dresses and cook in the kitchen. Oh no. So these cookbooks were also to show that the women involved in the suffrage movement had cooking chops as well, that they were still in the kitchens, they were still providing for their families, even though they would like the right to vote. These were also fundraiser cookbooks as well, that they were sold to raise money for suffrage movements. Other messaging as well. Some of the later ones definitely got a lot sassier. In the suffrage cookbook of 1915, you find a recipe for pie for a suffragist doubting husband. The ingredients include 1 quart milk of human kindness and 8 reasons: war, white slavery, child labor, 8 million working women, bad roads, poisonous water, and impure food. The implication being that not only should women have a right to vote because they are working, but that also because they are the more moral gender, they are believed to be in the time that they can actually affect some of these difficult attitudes and situations in the world. The ingredients are: mix the crust with tact and velvet gloves, using no sarcasm, especially with the upper crust. Upper crust must be handled with extreme care, for they quickly sour if manipulated roughly. So if any of you are having difficult political conversations this election season, maybe the instructions of Pie for a Suffragist Doubting Husband will help you out. Let me know if it works. This is actually the introduction to the same sassy book. Anna Shaw was a very well-known suffragist. And hold on, I just have to move my toolbar, which is always annoying. There we go. And I'll read you her recipe. I have sent but one recipe to a cookbook, and that was a direction for driving a nail, as it has always been declared that women do not know how to drive nails. But that was when nails were a peculiar shape and had to be driven in a particular way. But now nails are made round, and there is no special way in which they need to be driven. So my favorite recipe cannot be given to you. As for my effort in the culinary line, I have not made an effort in the culinary line for more than at least 30 years, except once to make a clam pie, which was pronounced by my friends as very good, but I cannot remember how I made it. I have a favorite recipe, however, something of which I'm very fond and which I might give to you. I got it out of the newspapers, and it is as follows. Spread 1 or 2 rashers of lean bacon on a baking tin, cover it thickly with slices of cheese, and sprinkle a little mustard and paprika over it. Bake it in a slow oven for half an hour and serve with slices of dry toast. Now, that is a particular tasty dish if it is to be well done. I never did it, but somebody must be able to do it who could do it well. So I do love that later in the movement, a lot of the suffragists got sick of the no, I'm just a nice lady who's going to cook dinner for you anyway, and got a little sassy. It's not until the middle of the 20th century that we begin to see cookbooks that begin to focus on queer culture in America. The Alice B. Toklas cookbook is not overtly queer. It was published in 1954. Alice B. Toklas was Gertrude Stein's lifelong partner, and this cookbook was pulled together after Gertrude Stein's death. It includes recipes from their community, people who loved and knew them both. And it's also peppered throughout with personal essays by Alice B. Toklas, often talking about Stein and her personal domestic preferences. It displays a level of intimacy between two women in this lifelong partnership without being overtly queer, which was quite impossible at the time. By the way, just as a side note, I'm going to tell you why it's impossible. Don't worry. This has the first published recipe for pot brownies. It's actually it's hashish fudge is what she calls it, parentheses, which anyone could whip up on a rainy day. It's a little bit more like granola. It's like wheat granola. I haven't made it myself. I had it made for me. I put it on yogurt. Yeah, it was a good time. Thanks, Alice B. Toklas. Okay, why couldn't that book be overtly queer? Why couldn't she come out and say, yeah, Gertrude Stein and I were partners? Well, because up until the 1960s, it would have been illegal to buy that book through the mail or to send that book through the mail. So from the 1870s until the 1960s, America had various obscenity laws. And one of the biggest ones was called the Comstock laws, and it affected what it controlled American sexuality by banning things that could be sent through the mail. One big category is birth control, ranging from condoms and diaphragms to birth control pills once they were invented. And the other big category is anything that was deemed pornographic, which included any material referencing same-sex couplings. So I am going to get a little political here for just a moment, because one of the things that Project 2025, the outline of the Republican plan should Trump get into office, outlines is bringing back these Comstock laws to specifically ban the sale of birth control and ban the shipments of birth control. Again, everything from pills to condoms, but also to ban the sale of pornography, which again, historically included any content that talked about same-sex relationships. So these are extreme laws that were put into place in the 19th century. When they were finally repealed in the 1960s, that meant that this fun little literally gay cookbook could finally be published. Doubleday takes a risk on it, literally a book that would have been considered illegal to sell just 5 years before it came out. This book is really important in queer history because also to this point, I mean, not only is any kind of same-sex relationship treated as pornography, but also gayness was only understood within the context of criminals. It was a criminal act that you could be arrested for. And actually, you could be arrested for in Texas up until the early 2000s. So this cookbook displays gay men and gay male culture and partnerships and relationships as being colorful and fun rather than illicit. There are all these little really cute illustrations. There's all of this sort of camp language in it. Like you can see this line after fruit salad, it says, "Oh, behave, Gussie." So there's all this sort of self-referential language, but it wasn't intended just for gay men. This was supposed to be a book that appealed to everybody, a wild, wacky book with really good recipes in it too. Another really cute little illustration and the table of content. I just want to mention this one briefly. This is also a really early gay cookbook. This comes from a temple in San Francisco. That was the first gay Jewish temple. I've made their lox recipe at home. It's wonderful. But one of the things, I didn't have a picture of the page. One of the things I really loved about it is that there are suggested menus in the back. This is a fundraising cookbook for this synagogue. And one of the menus is like there's a pride parade day brunch menu. There's a coming out party menu. Again, it's recontextualizing these events in a form of joy and being out of the closet rather than hidden and illicit. Now, lox was delicious. The People's Philadelphia Cookbook has only recently been rediscovered. Really, it was like in a mildewy box at a flea market, and an astute culinary historian picked it out. This is an organization, the People's Club of Philadelphia. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to check my notes so I remember what they're called, but I'm also going to keep talking. Don't you worry. So they funded in Philadelphia other organizations. They were not necessarily a charity, they were an activism fund. Yeah, the People's Fund. There it is. I knew I would find it. So the People Fund funded groups like the United Farm Workers, the Activist Alliance of Philadelphia, excuse me, give me 1 second. I want to give you more. The Gay Activist Alliance of Philadelphia, as well as the Black Panther Party. And actually, when the Black Panther Party came to them for aid, there was sort of a question of, well, should we fund them? They've got a really bad rap. And their sort of board of trustees said, well, if we don't fund the Black Panthers, then how are we like anybody else? This was basically to subvert and go around organizations that would only donate to charities that seemed acceptable and nice and that everybody would like. And this donated money to causes and organizations that in the 70s felt a little bit more fringe to most Americans. And the pages are really quite marvelous because it's a fundraising cookbook. It's recipes that are contributed by their various organizers. So, for example, you're going to see a Puerto Rican beef stew from some of the Puerto Rican organizations in Philadelphia. There was another one called A Very Gay Meatloaf, which was a gay activist recipe. And it was a combination of a Alice B. Toklas recipe and a Craig Claiborne recipe, New York Times food critic, also a gay man. So these two iconic gay people within food. And there was like a sandwich recipe for people who ran a activism printing press and they had to stay up late at night. And it's a simple sandwich, but it would keep them going. So the Black Panthers, we're going to come back to them a little bit, but they often used money to run a free breakfast program. So although in the time they're contextualized as being violent, largely because they were seen as being anti-white, their main mission was to make sure that kids had breakfast before school, which is something that we're still trying to do in the 21st century. So briefly, I want to mention cookbooks by incarcerated people. One of them is called Cooking Outside the Box. I know the cookbook is real, it exists. It's referenced all over the place, but I don't even have a photo of it and I don't know what it looks like. It's probably one of the earliest to come out in the 1990s. These cookbooks are important because it gives humanity and a little bit of independence and autonomy to people who are incarcerated. They show an incredible amount of innovation by taking the simple foods that are available, for sale in the commissary and turning it into meals that are shared together. Our Last Meals is another one written by a man who is still on death row. And Prison Ramen is one of the most modern ones. And it is about basically that ramen is the sort of base flour of a lot of these recipes. And in an interview with the author of this cookbook, who's formerly incarcerated, he said that these cookbooks start popping up in the 90s because that's when we stopped feeding prisoners. Before the 1990s, if you were incarcerated, you were getting 3 hot meals a day. Today, you get a light breakfast, you get a brown bag lunch that might be like peanut butter bread and an apple, and then you get a hot meal at dinner. A lot of people know too that those meals are reduced to save price. So often it's some sort of like gray congealed meatloaf, maybe a little bit of canned veggies. Like the health options, it's less healthy than school lunch at this point. And if you were a full grown man that's weighing 200, 300 pounds, that's simply not enough food. Additionally, there used to be sort of work release programs where, for example, prisoners were working in the kitchens and they were learning valuable skills for post release. And that's no longer happening. If you're working, you're making license plates for 17 cents an hour. So prison conditions have gotten a lot worse, and especially in terms of health and nutrition, which many argue is along the lines of a cruel and unusual punishment. So we see these cookbooks coming up because people have had to learn how to be really innovative in order to literally survive a sentence of even just a couple years. So we'll just go over briefly a couple modern cookbooks that are activist cookbooks. Now, though, is a great time to put your questions in the chat, and I'll open it up and we'll get to those too. So the World Central Kitchen is Jose Andres, not for profit. It's a group of chefs and volunteers who travel the world serving people on the front lines, whether it's a natural disaster or, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you have heard that several volunteers died while doing work in Palestine, trying to feed people on the ground during the Palestinian genocide. So this cookbook is a fundraising cookbook, and it includes recipes from not just the volunteers, but the people of the different cultures in which World Central Kitchen has embedded. We still see cookbooks that advocate for a certain way of eating, decolonize your diet, going back to an older American way of eating before livestock was introduced to it. We also see cookbooks that just say, I am here, I am present. And that is a form of activism, like Watermelon and Red Birds, the cookbook that came out of recipes to celebrate Juneteenth, which is now a federal holiday. This one isn't overtly activist, but Labor Day, Bobby Q, Grill to the People, motherfucker. Wait, I just want to get his name really quick. Bobby Sales. He's one of the founding members of the Black Panthers, and he talks a lot about in this book and in interviews, not only how the Black Panthers had that free breakfast initiative for kids, but also one of the ways that they would fundraise is through barbecue. They would make 300 plates at $6 a plate, and they would be funded for the year. He also talks about that he learned to barbecue from his grandfather in Texas. His grandfather had a barbecue place that was for Black folks only. This is still in the time of segregation. White folks could come and buy barbecue for takeout, and they said, hey, we love your food so much, we'd love to be able to sit down and eat it. So his grandfather built a restaurant that was the opposite of most Southern restaurants at that time, that would have a nice dining room for the white people and then a small dining room to the side for the Black people. He had the nice dining room for the Black people in his neighborhood and a little smaller, not as nice dining room for the white people who wanted to dine in. And one of my favorite books, really, this is a slender one and a great read, Feed the Resistance. This came out in 2016. And not only is it recipes divided into categories like how to feed a crowd if you're having a meeting, or recipes for fundraising, it's interspersed with really wonderful essays, including my favorite about how to participate in activism without burning yourself out. It's really sound, actionable advice, and I highly, highly recommend it. I also made a recipe for bison meatballs from here, which I really enjoyed. All right, everybody, that's it. I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to pop open the chat, and if anyone has any other questions, now is a great time to put them in. Lisa, you just made me laugh. Okay. Oh, Cindy, I'm so glad that you were here too. Graham began vegetarianism so early, and there were a couple people that were even earlier than him. Notably Pythagoras of the Pythagorean theorem of triangles. He was a vegetarian. He was pretty extreme. He also didn't let his followers eat beans because he believed that beans were kind of like fetuses and you shouldn't eat the beginning of life. He was a lot. And Ben Franklin was briefly vegetarian too, but he says it was not for moral reasons. It's because he wanted to save money so he could buy more books. So there we go. Is that vegetarian cookbook still able to say yes? Everything on here is online. And you know what, Chelmsford Library? If I send you an email with links, could you send it out to anybody who wants it? Okay, great. So I have a list of everything I talked about with links to the historical cookbooks online so you can still see them. And yes, Lisa, I am technically omnivorous at home. I largely eat vegetarian, and there are tons. It's my preferred way of eating. I usually only eat meat for work nowadays, but I really did like that 1910 vegetarian cookbook. There are some quite good. Oh, and more. Okay, so another question from Delicious Recipes. So yes, I provide links. If you go to my blog, which is now retired, but the whole archive is available. I'm going to put the link in the chat. I ate a lot of these diets for a week. I did raw, I did vegan, I did vegetarian, I did Kellogg's separately. I did some work on Graham. Just go to my blog and there's a little search box there. You can search at the top of the page. And I would eat for like 5 or 7 days and post all of the recipes and all of the reviews. So go down a rabbit hole. You'll have a great time. Yes, in 1906, Upton Sinclair wrote about the horrors of Chicago meat processing plants in the jungle. Yes. Okay. Yes. These are 2 great points, Francine. First of all, it's so funny you mentioned that because I also did an event this morning for a group in Florida, and it was literally about the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, Upton Sinclair, and the jungle. If you would like to learn more about all of that, I highly recommend a book and a documentary by the same name. I'll put that in the chat too. It's called The Poison Squad. The book is by Deborah Bloom. I misspelled squad. The documentary is on American Experience. You can find it on your local PBS station. And it explains that entire era, who the Poison Squad were, it's Teddy Roosevelt, Upton Sinclair, and this man named George Harvey Washington Wiley that really created this food legislation that made food edible in America, essentially, in this really interesting time. So I recommend those, and also The Bully Pulpit, which is not just the biography of Roosevelt, but it really focuses on this turn of the century time when Roosevelt is like trust busting and it goes after the meat trust and things like that too. Yes, more Jews observe kosher at Passover than any other time, because one of the most interesting things to me about immigration and assimilation in America is that we tend to hang on to our heritage at holidays the most. So I'm sure that whether you're Jewish at Passover or at Rosh Hashanah, or you are Christian at Christmas or Easter, or you are Muslim during Ramadan, even if you are not practicing, even if you're not going to church, even if you are 3 or 4 generations American, there is some recipe there that you have to make, that it won't be the holidays without it, that it's got to be on the table, and that is probably connected to one of your ancestors or to your cultural heritage. I think that is fascinating. Comstock laws has not been repealed, or are still on the books. Oh, Jesus, Francine. We got some work to do, don't we? Because if those things are still on the books, then they can come back at any time. And all of a sudden, any education about sex, about birth control, about LGBTIA+, all of that can come right back. Do you want to speak some more on that, Francine? Is that why your hand is raised? Do you want to come on audio? You can. I don't know how to do it. I think you can just unmute yourself. Yeah or no? Hi, Francine. Go for it, girl. Ask to unmute. I got you.
Okay. I found that.
Go for it, Francine.
Okay. Yes. That's the why I put it on the chat. We think of it as being old time. It is from the 1800s, and Comstock actually was a physician at Columbia University, and then he became a public official and so on and so forth. The only part of the Comstock Act that was repealed in a way was the contraceptives, that you can mail contraceptives, and that's what they want to bring back. And so that's why we have to be alert.
Oh, it's so many ways too. And like I said, if these are already on the books, that means you can start leaning into the other sides of it too. Thank you, Francine. Shirley is incredibly offended. I called Israel's attempt to defend itself following the horrific Hamas attack of Palestinian genocide. The Hamas attack was horrific, and it is a Palestinian genocide. Sorry, the state of Israel is murdering people. That's not anti-Jewish. That is anti the Israeli government. It's a terrible thing that I hate to see happening. And I'll say it again, Shirley. So sorry. Thank you, Nancy. I appreciate that. Activism is different than politics. Keep politics out of your presentation. Incorrect. Activism is directly influencing politics. In general, what you're trying to do is speak up for and represent a group of people to create legislative change in the government. For example, we literally talked about suffrage today. What is more political than women trying to get the right to vote? So sorry, not sorry, Shirley. And if this talk was upsetting to you, then we really need to rethink what activism is and how we support our other community members. And I suspect as well that you're offended about what I said about Palestine. There are different ways to handle what is happening over there. Additionally, there's now bombings in Lebanon and Syria. This is not a good situation, and I would appreciate that we went into diplomacy as opposed to the murder of civilians and committing war crimes, which is happening. Now, I'm not an expert in Israel-Palestine, but the UN is, and the UN is not happy about it either. Well, not to get too political, I did start it. Yep, Palestinian death, the poison squad. Any place is the appropriate place to argue, honestly, Marie, like, talk to your friends, have conversations where you can respect each other without name calling. But I think that the whole point, this is talk about activism. So yeah, I am going to be really honest about all of this stuff, because all of these cookbooks, they were trying to raise money, but they were trying to get a point across. And many of them were not mincing words. We might think that the sass in that 1915 suffragist cookbook is funny to us now, but ladies out there, how deeply offended men were by that. You can look up some of the absolute misogynist propaganda that was put out in that world to deny women the vote because we were seen as too stupid to vote. We were seen as that we would only vote the same as our husbands. So what's the point in having double votes for the same thing? You all know that's not true, but that was the worldview 100 years ago. So this is an appropriate place to talk about all of these things because these were controversial topics at one time. We're comfortable with them now because they're in the past. And the Palestinian genocide is not inherently anti-Semitic. It's about Israel, not the Jewish people. The Jungle, yes. So The Jungle was actually written, as Sinclair said, to hit people in the heart, but he hit them in the gut. It was supposed to be about the working conditions of these plants, but then the new legislation, political, that came out of this activism was to create laws preventing the adulteration of food, as well as things like creating a list of forbidden ingredients like opioids and things like that, and adding a ingredients list and truth in advertising. Marie, I'm not going to stop. You can go if you'd like to. I'm fine with that too, or I would welcome you to stay in this free talk that you are here completely optionally at. But yeah, Sinclair really wanted improvement for workers' rights, which, to make another connection to the present day, there are still major labor violations within meatpacking plants. People get very injured on the line doing this work that's highly repetitive and is done very, very quickly. And just like when Sinclair wrote The Jungle, the people working in meatpacking plants and meat processing plants today are largely immigrants. They're people who English is not their first language. They're people who don't know their rights. They're people who might be in this country undocumented and are afraid to speak up for safer conditions. So even though there's been 130 years difference, there are still a lot of the same workers' issues that Sinclair wrote about in his book. Thanks, everybody. Oh, Marie. Okay, then I'm sorry. He just said stop arguing. It's okay, Marie. They can go. We don't have to listen to them. I get it. Besides cookbooks, emphasis books, are there activist websites focused on the topic? Oh, Francine, I should also say that I have a visual arts degree. There were no majors in food history when I was in school in 2000 to 2005. Now there are, but they're very, very new. Only within the past 10 years have institutions started adding food history classes, food history tracks, and food history majors. Hold on. Are there activist websites focused on the topic of the history of activism, Susan? Is that what you're asking? My blog, I'm going to put it in one more time. 4poundsflour.com. Also, if you search for me, it will come up as well. Oops. Current recipes. Yeah. I don't know off the top of my head. Oh, actually, all of the cookbooks I mentioned have websites, especially Feed the Resistance and especially World Central Kitchen. And I think that there will be recipes on there as well. If I can think of something else that is sort of activism recipe based, I mean, of course, just like in these historical cookbooks, it would be based by topic too, and how you can help. If you are interested in there are a couple. Oh shoot, you all. That's exactly right, Cindy. I was just writing hosts and panelists. So my blog is 4poundsflour.com. I'm going to put it in again. I'm also going to put in the Poison Squad, which I can't spell all of a sudden. And World Central Kitchen. Just follow what they're doing. They go all over the place. I mean, they have worked with natural disasters here in the United States. As I mentioned, they're in Palestine feeding people. Some people died doing that. Also a war crime. You should not be killing volunteers. And they are doing great work. They accept donations. They share recipes. They have such a great culture around them. And Jose Andres is a really, really good dude. Hey, thanks, Vicky. I appreciate that too. The reason I do this work is because I was always attracted to food history because it allows you a way to talk about often difficult issues in the present through this historical lens. And I like being able to look back and seeing this thread through all of history of people using food to talk about different issues and bring us together. I know this talk got tough, but I'm here to be honest, and I'm here to try to do well by these people of the past. Yeah, they fund themselves through donations. So World Central Kitchen is on Instagram. They're a great follow as well. I don't have a cookbook, so I can't recommend. I do have Feed the Resistance, and I do really like that one as well. Thank you for listening, everyone. And thank you for having me, Chelmsford. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. I know we've had to postpone it a couple times now, but I'm so happy we were able to have it. And of course, thank you for, prompting these important conversations as well as teaching it through this lens. It's incredibly fascinating. And again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. Also, be sure to check out some of Sarah's books. Like I said, 8 Flavors, The Untold Story of American Cuisine, and the most recent Endangered Eating, Exploring America's Vanishing Cuisine. I've read both of them. I love them both. Highly recommend. So definitely check those out. And again, thank you so much, Sarah. This was great.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone. If you want to hear about future events and things, I mean, of course, through Chelmsford, but sometimes I'm out east doing things in person. So you can sign up for my newsletter on my website as well, sarahlohman.com.
Awesome. And remember, everyone, you should be receiving an email with the recording for tonight's presentation, along with some of those links that Sarah's going to send us as well. So thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.